Well, delighted to get a few minutes with Akshit, who is a robotics engineer at Near Earth Autonomy. Akshit, thank you for taking the time.
No problem, Viraj. Glad to be here. Lovely talking to you today.
Awesome. Let's start with a quick introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yep. My name is Akshit Mishra. I am a robotics engineer currently working at Near Earth Autonomy. Near Earth Autonomy does autonomy software and stacks for large scale and medium scale drones and helicopters. Prior to coming to Near Earth, I was a robotics research student at Carnegie Mellon University in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, where I worked on motion planning and SLAM problems at the Robomechanics lab with Professor Aaron Johnson.
Got it. And when did you graduate from Carnegie Mellon University?
I graduated from Carnegie Mellon this year in the springs at the end of spring semester itself. So at the end of May 2021 is when I completed my graduation from Carnegie Mellon University.
Got it. When did you start searching for full time job opportunities?
So the search for full-time roles began at the beginning of the year 2020,
Okay.
which looking back was not a very favorable time. But I had ended my internship in the past summer and then was busy cultivating my skill set after that. And once I had some time after finishing my fall semester, is when I started looking for full-time opportunities.
Got it. And how did you approach your job search at the beginning when you started searching for your full time job opportunities?
Initially, I leveraged my personal connections a little bit. So the Carnegie Mellon University has a very well-known robotics community, and the Pittsburgh area is also known for having a very strong robotics startup community. So I leveraged some personal connections. I reached out to people that I had met either through seminars or either through people who visited our labs during one of the lab tours. I introduced myself. I let them know what I'm currently interested in, and I let them know what I am looking forward to working on in the future. Gave them my resume in the introductory email itself, and then waited to hear back from them from that point on. That was the initial step. And while I was doing this simultaneously, I was also building my virtual network because COVID had already happened at that point, and in person interactions were very limited. So I started building my LinkedIn network itself so that I could expose my profile and my search for job opportunities to a larger base.
Phenomenal. And looking back now, would you have changed the approach you took for searching for jobs?
Yeah, looking back, I had the guidance of a lot of people who had done a job search in the past. So this would be PhD students in my lab who had worked in the industry prior to coming to academia full time as PhD students, or other mentors that I met through my classes or through my projects or just team building stuff that we did outside classes and lab itself. So I had the opportunity of learning from their experience. But when I initially started applying for jobs, I saw that if you reach out to 10 recruiters or 20 recruiters, you may or may not even hear back from one or two of them. And I started to look at why was this the case, because me being a student ambassador, I was also responsible for helping other students navigate these opportunities. So in my opinion, if I could go back and change something, what I would do is, instead of just reaching out to recruiters, I would actually look at the company and look at the team at the company that I'm interested in. So in my example, if I were interested in working in motion planning, I would look at the motion planning team in that company and maybe reach out to the hiring manager or the engineering manager in that company, because they would be able to gauge my skill set in a better way as to how my current skills would translate to a positive contribution to the company. So that would be the only tweak that I would make to my approach.
Phenomenal. What did you do to actually get the interviews from the companies that you were applying for?
Yes, that's a really good question, because reaching out and talking to people is a different thing, and getting interviews is totally different thing. Um, So one thing that I started to do from my second semester onwards itself is Carnegie Mellon gives you a lot of opportunities in exposing yourself to classes that have team projects, and these team projects are usually structured in a way that they are very relevant to what's happening in the industry. So I will give you the example of my motion planning class, where the project that I did for this that class was a full-on implementation of an autonomous drone that was to do inspection in thermal power plants. So where human reach is not feasible or it might jeopardize human lives, that's what we worked on our full project, and that is something that we fully implemented on simulated robot itself. So what I did was more things that I did either in the lab or either in classes. I started to put them out on my LinkedIn channel itself. And when I put them out on my LinkedIn profile, I linked them directly to what skills I want to work in. So if I did a motion planning project, I made sure that I mentioned the technical terms that I covered in that project itself. So that if a recruiter happens to stumble upon that post of mine or my profile, or if a hiring manager stumbles upon that post, they can directly link that project to the technical skill set they might be looking for in a particular position at their company.
Nice. Looking back now, would you have done something different to get the interviews from the companies that you're applying for?
Yes, like I said earlier, in the initial phases of my job search, I was just reaching out to recruiters and waiting back to hear from them. And if I didn't hear from them, I would move on to the next company. But a month or two into the process of applying for jobs, when I started to reach out to my personal connections in those companies who were in technical positions, or started creating new channels of communication by establishing a connection with a hiring manager or technical hiring manager, and telling them about my skill sets and what I'm interested in. That is something that really helped me in changing my approach and getting more interviews.
Got it. How did you prepare for the interviews that you got?
That's a really good question because, especially in robotics, it's so diverse that the industry has still not structured a very well formulated interview process for us. But I can speak for the software roles in the robotics domain. What happens is these roles are where you're working with robots, but you're mainly writing algorithms and codes for the robots. So they are very similar in terms of how you would approach an interview for a computer science job. So you are exposed to lead code problems, and you're supposed to know the fundamentals of coding in terms of big O notation and different algorithms, dynamic programming. So the first time I started preparing for interviews, I started doing lead code problems and tried to get a hold of as many problems as I could.
Got it. Looking back now, would you have done something different to prepare for the interviews?
Yep. That's a very relevant question, not only for me, but also from what I've spoken to students over time. So when I started preparing for interviews, like I said, I did as many lead code problems as I could to get a hold of these problems, which turns out was not the best approach because I could not retain a lot of information that I gather from solving these problems. So if I did 100 problems, I could maybe only gather or retain information about 5 to 10 problems, which is not a very high conversion ratio. So what I changed from that point on is that instead of randomly picking problems and doing them, I started looking at resources that group these coding problems into patterns. So when I look at a problem, now I already have a corresponding map. Okay, this is a problem of dynamic programming. So I have an exoskeleton for the problem itself, and now I can start to fill in the blanks into that problem. As compared to when I'm only doing the problem and a problem is presented to me in an interview, and I'm starting from ground zero. But if I have this bank of questions that are categorized based on different coding patterns and algorithms, at least you have a starting point that you can build upon. And from that point on, the more you code, the better you get at making those identifications for problems.
That's such a phenomenal way of looking at how to prepare for interviews, just compartmentalizing different algorithms, or I guess the different structures that you can potentially use. That's a great advice.
For sure. I think it comes back to the point of working hard or working smart, right? Initially, I was working hard, but because I have limited time as a student, I had to find these tips and tricks to navigate the process more efficiently.
Absolutely. Pivoting towards some company specific questions, how did you come across your specific role of robotics engineer at your company, Near Earth Autonomy?
So I had the opportunity of interning with this company at first. So when I came to Carnegie Mellon University, I went to their in-person career fair.
Mhm.
There I met with their head of engineering, talked to them, and then I had a follow-up interview from there where they uh, learned about what I was currently working on and what my interests were. And then I was given the position of a robotic system developer as an intern, where I worked on improving the SLAM capabilities of drones. It was
Got it.
slightly different when I got the full time offer
Mhm.
from them. For that, what happened was that after I had done all the series of interviews with them, uh, the director of engineering set up a 1 hour call with me, and she gauged what I had been working on in my research, in my classes, and in my projects. And then she asked me what piqued my interest most in terms of all of these projects that I had covered so far. And then she went on to the matching process where she reached out to project managers in the company, looked at what projects are going on currently and what projects are to come next, and then matched me with a suitable project based on my interests.
Got it. And that was for the full time position?
That was for the full time position of a robotic system engineer.
Got it. That kind of ties to the next question I was about to ask. How did you get the interview for this role, the full time role in particular? I know you mentioned that you went through the internship with the same company,
Yes.
but thinking about once you were done with your internship and you were looking at searching for full time roles, how did that look like? Like, when did you, were you reached out by the company or did you reach out to the company? How did that look like?
The company had a defined process in terms of how they go about gauging new candidates, whether they are interns or not. After I had completed my internship, they sat down with my mentor and looked at the work that I had done as an intern and gathered feedback from a mentor himself. And after analyzing his feedback and feedback from the team that I had worked with, they reached out to me a little while later, that telling me that they were impressed with the work that I had done, and my mentor was really using the tools that I had created as an intern, and they were being used in real world development of these autonomy stacks. So from that point on, after they had expressed interest from their end, I also showed mutual interest in the company and working for the company in the full-time position because I had a great experience of learning in my internship. Then they scheduled a virtual on-site that spanned over 3 days. So usually this on-site happens in one day where you meet with different head of engineering, director of engineering, principal robotic engineer in the same day, and you go through a series of interviews, 5 to 6 interviews usually. But because it was virtual, it was spanned across 3 days where I met with everyone starting from the COO to CEO to director of engineering, head of engineering, principal robotics engineer, and they presented me with different real world robotics problems and whiteboard coding questions to gauge my skill set at that point.
Got it. So you already answered the next question I was about to ask, which is what was the interview process like? So you had that 3 day virtual interview, back to back sessions with different people of the company. And I'm assuming that they range from behavioral interviews to technical interviews to you answering some of the technical questions. Is that how it went?
Yes, so you are pretty close as to how the process actually went. And what I learned by interviewing with almost a dozen company while I was looking for a full-time position is that the interview process itself speaks volumes about the company. So in this particular case, where I accepted the full-time position, their interview process was actually looking at real-world robotic skills. So the hands-on work that I had done in my lab in terms of not only developing these algorithms, but also implementing these algorithms on robots with sensors and other uh, accessories and components that were needed. So they were questioning me about, let's say, you had a robot out in the field, and we gathered this particular set of data from that robot using a particular visual or inertial sensor. But when we came back to the office to process the data, we saw these deficiencies in the data. So, what do you think could have been the reason? So, this is a very real world problem that I might be solving as a full time engineer, right? So, this was the nature of the questions that they asked. And then, obviously, you have the whiteboard coding questions as to, okay, let's say we want to implement this particular algorithm in the robot. How would you go about designing the architecture, and how would you lay out the code to make it more efficient?
No. And how long after the last interview did you get the offer?
The turnaround time in that was approximately 3 to 4 weeks. So
Okay,
after we had done all the virtual on-site interviews, uh, it took them 3 to 4 weeks to just gather up and discuss the feedback from the interviews, and then they extended a full-time offer to me.
got it. Any last piece of advice for any international student who is seeking for full-time job opportunities in the US?
So for international students, one thing that is often repeated, and I would like to do that too, is a lot of companies, the work they do might seem that they don't hire international students, and the companies might not even advertise that they hire international students. But as a student, as someone who's looking to work in the industry, it's our job to position ourselves in a way where wherever there is an opportunity, we have a foot in the door at least. So I would say don't hesitate to reach out even to the companies that don't advertise that they hire international students if you are really, really interested in the work that they're doing. And the
Amazing.
second piece of not advice, it's more of something that I've learned over the years is that because we are international students, in most cases, we pay a hefty tuition that sometimes we take loans or through other means we pay the tuition. So when we come to the universities to study, we become a little timid in terms of risk taking.
Yes.
But I would just say that if you're interested in something which is outside your plan of study or even your department,
Mhm.
always give that a chance to at least where you give yourself the chance to take that particular class, even if that's outside your plan of study. Sometimes your semesters are packed, you don't have any units left, credits left, but that one class could really turn things around for you.
That's a great advice. Akshit, thank you for taking the time. Really appreciate the perspective and the amazing insights that you shared.
Thanks a lot, Viraj. Thanks a lot for having me today. And I'm sure this podcast is helping so many students today and will do so in the future as well. Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.